The morning Milton Townsend threw down his pitchfork and turned to face Gertrude Ellsworth with eyes full of something she had never seen in a man before, something raw and desperate and dangerously close to love. She realized with a cold, hollow certainty that she had been lying to herself for months. "You need to stop coming here," she said, her voice cutting through the dry Kansas air like a blade. "You hear me, Milton? You need to stop." He stood in the middle of her barn, hay dust settling around him like gold powder in the early light, his broad chest heaving, his jaw set in that infuriating way he had when he was trying to hold something enormous inside himself. The chickens clucked and scattered, the old roan mare shifted in her stall, and Gertrude stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I won't," he said, just those two words, flat and final and full of everything she was afraid of. "Milton, this is not—" She stopped herself, pressed her fingers against her lips. The betrayal she felt was not his betrayal, she understood that now. The betrayal was her own. It was the betrayal of a woman who had told herself she did not need anyone, who had buried her grief in hard work and stubbornness, and who had somehow, without ever giving permission, let this man become the most important thing in her mornings. "You don't own this barn," she said, trying for anger because anger was safer than grief. "You don't own this property. You have your own cattle, your own hands, your own land on the other side of Cutter's Creek. So why in God's name have you been coming here every single morning before the sun is even up, doing chores I never asked you to do, acting like you belong here, acting like I—" Her voice broke. She hated herself for it. Milton took a step toward her, just one, slow and careful, like a man approaching something he desperately did not want to frighten away. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to something rough and quiet, "you shouldn't have to do it alone." Gertrude stared at him. The silence between them was enormous, and it held everything. All the mornings he had arrived before dawn, all the chores completed before she had pulled on her boots, all the time she had pretended not to notice, not to feel the particular warmth of knowing someone was out there in the dark, choosing her. This is where she made her mistake. This is where she looked at him, really looked, and the whole carefully constructed wall she had been building since Thomas died came apart in her hands like wet paper. But to understand how two people can arrive at a moment like that, standing in a Kansas barn in the autumn of 1878, with their whole lives balanced on two words spoken into dust and morning light, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day Gertrude Ellsworth arrived in Harrow County with a dead husband's name, an infant son, and nothing but grit to hold herself together. The year was 1877, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, was not a gentle place for a woman alone. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, where cattle drives pushed north through the summer heat, and drovers spent their wages on whiskey and trouble. The streets were wide and dusty, and full of men who had opinions about women who didn't belong to anyone. The railroad had come through 5 years prior, bringing with it a particular brand of rough commerce that made the local lawmen perpetually weary and the respectable citizens perpetually anxious. Gertrude had not come to Caldwell by choice. She had come because Thomas Ellsworth, her husband of 3 years, had purchased a quarter section of land outside of town the previous spring, convinced that Kansas soil would make them rich, and that the cattle trade moving through would make them richer. Thomas had been a man of great enthusiasms and limited foresight. He had died of a fever in July before he ever saw the land, leaving Gertrude with a 7-month-old son named Henry, a land deed, a small savings of $40, and a decision to make. She could go back to Ohio, back to her father's house, back to the life of a woman who had failed at her one attempt at independence, or she could go to Kansas. Gertrude Ellsworth was not a woman who went backward. She arrived in Caldwell on the 3rd of September, 1877, on the morning stage from Wichita, holding Henry against her chest and watching the prairie roll out in every direction like a great tawny sea. The other passengers, 2 traveling merchants and a cattle broker, had regarded her with the particular mix of pity and suspicion that men reserved for women who were clearly in some kind of trouble. She had ignored them with a dignity that cost her considerable effort. The land Thomas had bought was 8 miles southeast of town, along a creek the locals called Cutter's Creek, where the grass was good and there was reliable water. A previous homesteader had left a 2-room soddy and a small barn, and these Gertrude found waiting for her when she arrived with her trunks in the back of a rented wagon. The soddy was dark and smelled of earth and old wool. The barn needed new boards on the south wall. The well was good. She stood in the doorway of that small, dark house with Henry on her hip and told herself that this was enough, that it was a beginning. The first winter was the hardest thing she had ever survived. She had arrived too late to plant anything. The $40 disappeared into flour, cornmeal, salt pork, lamp oil, and a second-hand rifle she spent 3 weeks learning to use properly, because a woman alone on the Kansas prairie without a working knowledge of firearms was simply asking to become a cautionary tale. She kept a small flock of chickens that she bought from a widow in town named Mrs. Abernethy, who also taught her how to preserve eggs in a barrel of lime water so they would keep through the cold months. She traded mending and sewing for what she could not afford to buy. She learned to bank the fire carefully at night and to read the sky for weather changes the way the old-timers did. Henry grew and fussed and became the most important reason she had for getting out of bed in the mornings when the wind was screaming across the plains and the temperature dropped to 20 below, and she was so tired that lying down and not getting up again seemed like a reasonable option. She did not lie down. Not once. Spring came with mud and relief, and the terrible amount of work required to plant a kitchen garden and put in a small crop of corn and sorghum. She acquired a milk cow she named Patience, and a draft horse she named Trouble, because trouble was exactly the word for a horse who had opinions about everything. She fixed the south wall of the barn herself, with lumber she hauled from town on a wagon she drove with the particular focused determination of a woman who had no room in her life for self-pity. The neighbors were sparse, as neighbors tended to be on the Kansas prairie. There was a family named Holcomb 5 miles north, whose eldest daughter sometimes came to sit with Henry when Gertrude needed both hands free for heavy work. There was a widower named Dougal 3 miles east who had no interest in conversation or socializing and communicated primarily through nods. And there was the Townsend operation. Milton Townsend's cattle operation was the largest in the county. His ranch began at the western edge of Cutter's Creek and spread for several thousand acres in the direction of the setting sun, a spread that his father had built from nothing after the war, and that Milton had inherited at the age of 22 when the elder Townsend died of a heart complaint in 1872. Milton was 30 years old when Gertrude arrived, a tall, quiet man with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples and eyes the precise color of the creek in summer, that particular clear brown-green that a body could look into for a long time without finding the bottom. She had met him formally for the first time in October of 1877, when she had been in Caldwell at Horner's Mercantile, trying to calculate whether she could afford both the winter-weight wool and the salt she needed for putting up the last of her garden vegetables, and the arithmetic had not been going her way. She had been standing at the counter with her pencil and her small notebook, wearing her expression of fierce concentration, when a large hand had set down a 10-pound sack of salt beside her elbow. "Horner," the voice above the hand had said, "put this on the Townsend account." She had looked up. Milton Townsend had looked down. He had the kind of face that had clearly been handsome in a conventional sense when he was younger, and had since become interesting, which was better. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind, and his jaw carried the shadow of a beard he only remembered to shave about every 4 days. He wore working clothes, canvas trousers, a good flannel shirt, boots that were used but well kept, and he held his hat in his hand because he had apparently been raised correctly. "You're the Ellsworth widow," he had said. It was not unkind. It was simply a man placing a fact. "I am Gertrude Ellsworth," she had said, because she was nobody's widow. She was Gertrude, who happened to have lost a husband, which was not the same thing at all. Something in his expression had shifted just slightly. He had given a small nod that she now recognized, looking back, as the beginning of respect. "Milton Townsend. I run the spread on the other side of the creek." He had gestured generally westward. "You're on the old Sutter place." "I am on my land," she had said, "which was my husband's land and is now mine." Another small nod. "Welcome to Harrow County, Mrs. Ellsworth. It's hard country, but it's honest." He had left the salt at her elbow, paid for it without ceremony, and walked out of the mercantile. She had stood there for a moment looking at the sack of salt and feeling a complicated array of emotions that she had carefully organized into the category of irrelevant before picking it up and carrying it to her wagon. She had not thanked him. She understood now that this was where the whole strange story had actually begun, in that small act of defiance, that refusal to be gracious about something she had not asked for. Milton Townsend, as it turned out, was not deterred by ingratitude. He had come the first time in the middle of November, when a blue norther had been building all night, and the morning had arrived so cold and dark and mean that Gertrude had stood in her doorway with Henry balanced on her hip and looked at the barn and the animals inside it and understood, with a slow cold dread, that her hands were not going to be enough that morning. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees overnight. The water in the barrel by the door had a skin of ice. Trouble and patience would need water broken from the trough, feed hauled from the back of the barn where she had stacked it, and all of this in a wind that was cutting straight off the northern prairie like it had a personal grudge. She had handed Henry to his small wooden cradle with a rolled quilt, wrapped herself in everything she owned, and gone out to the barn. It had taken her 40 minutes to do what should have taken 15, and when she had come back inside, her fingers so cold she could barely unfasten the buttons on her coat, she had found the water bucket by the door filled, and a stack of split wood piled beside the stove that had not been there when she went out. She had stood in the middle of her soddy looking at that wood for a very long time. The next morning she had watched out the small window, and in the gray pre-dawn light she had seen the dark shape of a man moving from her woodpile to her barn to her water trough, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done these chores 10,000 times. He had left before she could dress Henry and get to the door. He had not knocked. He had not announced himself. He had simply come and done the work and gone. This had continued. Every morning, through the rest of that bitter first winter, Milton Townsend had arrived at her property in the hour before dawn. He mucked out the stalls before she got to them. He broke the ice in the water trough. He checked the fence line on the north side of her small pasture where the wind was worst. He filled her woodpile. He did all of this without asking, without announcing, and without appearing to require any acknowledgement. Gertrude, for her part, had oscillated between gratitude and fury in roughly equal measure. She confronted him the first time in February, catching him at the barn before he could slip away. "Mr. Townsend," she had said, her breath making white clouds in the frozen air, "I am perfectly capable of managing my own property." "Yes, ma'am," he had said. He had been rehanging her barn door, which had come off its upper hinge in a particularly savage wind, and he had not stopped working while he said it. "Then you can stop coming here." "I'll be done in about 10 minutes, he had said, concentrating on the hinge. "Door was going to take out the whole frame if it wasn't fixed. I was going to fix it." "I know you were." He had looked at her then, briefly, directly. "But I was already here." She had not been able to argue with the logic of that, which had infuriated her even further. He had finished the door, tipped his hat, and ridden back across Cutter's Creek on a large gray horse, and Gertrude had stood in her yard feeling something she could not name and was not prepared to examine. The pattern continued through the spring and into the summer of 1878. The pre-dawn visits became a fixed feature of her mornings, as reliable as the sunrise itself, and Gertrude made her peace with them in the way that a person makes their peace with something they have decided they cannot stop, not by accepting it, exactly, but by building her life around it in ways she refused to fully acknowledge. She began rising earlier. She began having the coffee ready. She told herself this was because she rose early anyway and the coffee was for herself. She began noticing when the chores he typically did showed signs of particular care. The way he stacked the wood so it was easy to reach from inside the barn. The way he always checked the pen latches twice before he left. The particular way he handled trouble, who was difficult with everyone except Milton, who seemed to understand the horse's moods in a way that Gertrude grudgingly admitted she did not. Henry adored him. This was perhaps the most dangerous thing. Henry, who at 8 months had been too young to understand anything, had grown through that first winter into a toddler with a sunny temperament and strong opinions. And from the first time, Milton had crouched down to Henry's level in the yard and let the boy touch the brim of his hat. Henry had decided that Mr. Townsend was the best thing in his small world. He called him Mitt. He ran to the door whenever he heard a horse approaching. He brought the man gifts, a smooth stone, a crow's feather, once a earthworm that Gertrude had been forced to intervene on. Milton, for his part, had accepted all of it with a gravity and warmth that made something ache in Gertrude's chest in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge. They had developed over those months a strange and cautious friendship. He would finish the chores, and sometimes, not always, just sometimes, he would come to the door of the soddy rather than riding straight back, and she would have the coffee ready, and they would stand on her small step and drink it while the morning light came up over the prairie. The conversations were not long. They talked about practical things: weather, cattle prices, the state of the road to Caldwell, the gossip from town. He told her things she needed to know about the land, where the sinkholes were after heavy rain, which part of the creek ran low in August, what the grass looked like when army worms were coming. She told him things in return that he did not already know. She had a way with sick animals. She could predict weather from cloud formations. She made the best dried apple pie that had ever been produced in Harrow County, a claim she made without self-consciousness, and that he verified the first time she put a tin plate in his hands and watched him eat. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn about prairie country, by paying attention over a long period of time, because it does not give up its secrets easily. He had been engaged once before his father died, to a girl from Wichita named Louisa. Louisa had not wanted to be a rancher's wife, had not wanted to live in Harrow County, had not wanted any of the things that Milton's life was made of, and she had eventually chosen not to pretend anymore and gone back east. Milton had not blamed her. He said this without bitterness, which told Gertrude more about his character than anything else could have. He had a younger brother, James, who had gone to Denver to read law and who sent letters twice a year, and came home for Christmas when the weather permitted. He had 3 hands who worked his cattle operation: a Mexican vaquero named Esteban who had been with the Townsend family since Milton was a boy, a young man from Tennessee named Rafe who had come north with a trail drive 2 years ago and never left, and a Wichita man named Curly whose actual name was Harold, and who had the most magnificent mustache in the county. He was not a man who talked much, but what he said mattered, and he listened with a quality of attention that Gertrude had found over her lifetime to be vanishingly rare in human beings and in men especially. She did not admit to herself that she was falling in love with him. She was extremely clear about this. She was not falling in love. She was a widow with a small child and a farm to run and no time, energy, or available heart for anything so reckless. Thomas had been dead for barely over a year. She was still finding her footing. The kindness of a neighbor, even a neighbor who expressed that kindness through pre-dawn manual labor performed without permission, did not constitute a reason to do something as catastrophically foolish as fall in love. She told herself this every morning when she heard his horse crossing the creek. The complication arrived in the form of a letter, in the first week of September 1878, exactly 1 year after Gertrude had arrived in Caldwell. It came from a man named Clarence Briggs, who identified himself as a creditor of Thomas Ellsworth's estate and who claimed, with the elaborate legal language of a man who had paid someone else to write the letter, that Thomas had borrowed $300 against the property before his death, and that this debt had transferred to the estate and was now overdue. $300. Gertrude sat at her small table with Henry asleep in the next room and that letter in her hands, and felt the particular quality of dread that comes from understanding that the ground you thought was solid might not be solid at all. She had not known about the debt. Thomas had not told her. This was not a surprise. Exactly, Thomas had been a man who managed bad news by not mentioning it to anyone until it became unavoidable. But the knowledge that her husband had hidden something this significant from her, that there was a trap waiting in the very land she had worked so hard to hold onto, felt like a betrayal that reached backward through grief and landed somewhere painful. She went to Caldwell the next morning to see the land office, and then to see Mr. Harrington, the attorney who handled most of the county's property disputes, and what she learned in those 2 visits confirmed the worst. Clarence Briggs was real, the debt was documented, and she had 30 days to pay it or face the legal mechanisms that could ultimately result in the loss of the property. She sat in the chair across from Mr. Harrington's desk and performed the mental arithmetic in full. The crop had been modest. The cattle she didn't have. The chickens were profitable in eggs but not in cash. Her savings were $12. She thanked Mr. Harrington, walked out of his office, stood on the boardwalk in the September sun with her hands clasped in front of her, and understood that she was in serious trouble. It was Milton who found her. He had been coming out of the hardware store across the street, and he had crossed to her side without ceremony, looked at her face, and said, "What happened?" She had not intended to tell him. The dark past of Thomas's financial secrets felt like her own shame, her own failure to have known and prevented this. But Milton was standing there in the morning sunlight looking at her with those cream-colored eyes full of that steady, particular attention, and she had told him everything. The letter, the debt, the arithmetic, the 30 days. He had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Briggs," he said, "Clarence Briggs out of Wichita. The letter came from Wichita, yes." Something moved across his face, something careful and guarded and complicated. "I know that name," he said. "He's been acquiring properties along the creek for 2 years, mostly from widows and families in hard straits." He paused. "He's a land speculator, Gertrude. He finds debts, buys them up, and then calls them in when he thinks there's no way to pay." The weight of that landed on her slowly. This was not just a creditor. This was a predator. This was a man who had identified her land, good land, creek land, the best water in the county, and had been waiting for the right moment to claim it. The debt Thomas had incurred had been turned into a weapon, and the weapon was pointed directly at everything she had built. "I won't lose it," she said. The words came out very quiet and very certain. "No," Milton said with the same quality of quiet certainty. "You won't." She had looked at him then. "I'm not asking you for money, Milton." "I know you're not." He was looking at the street, not at her. "But there's another option. The spring cattle drive brought strong prices this year. I was going to put that profit toward expanding the herd, but no," she said. "Absolutely not." "Gertrude," I said no. She turned to face him fully, and she heard the edge in her own voice and did not try to soften it. "You are my neighbor," and she hesitated, "my friend. You have been more than generous with your mornings, but I will not take your money. I will find another way." He had looked at her then, and there had been something in his expression, something frustrated and tender and complicated, that she had looked away from because she could not afford to look at it directly. "Then let me help you find the other way," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She had agreed, eventually, because there was not much else to agree to. What followed was 3 of the most concentrated and difficult weeks of Gertrude Ellsworth's life. She and Milton, together and separately, worked through every legal and financial option available. Milton drove to Wichita and spoke personally to James, his lawyer brother, who sent a long letter outlining the options and the protections that Kansas homestead law provided to women who were working their own land. It was not enough to eliminate the debt, but it created a legal argument that could delay proceedings long enough to give Gertrude time. Gertrude, meanwhile, did what women on the prairie had always done when faced with an impossible situation. She called in every favor, sold what she could sell, and worked. She sold half her chicken flock to Mrs. Abernethy and 3 other women in town, at a price that was fair to her because she refused to be desperate enough to undersell herself even now. She sold the old quilts Thomas had packed that she had never used. She sold her mending services at a flat rate to 4 families in Caldwell, who had more clothing than time. She discovered that the widow Holcomb had been quietly wanting to buy a section of her south pasture, the piece that abutted the Holcomb property, for 2 years, and she negotiated that sale carefully, giving up land she did not want to give up because keeping the house and the creekside acreage was more important than keeping every acre of the south field. It was enough. When the 30 days were up, Gertrude Ellsworth walked into Mr. Harrington's office with $270 and a legal argument prepared by James Townsend that challenged the terms of the original debt transfer under Kansas statutes. Harrington, who had a decent respect for a woman who refused to be beaten, helped her use that legal challenge to negotiate the remaining $30 down to $17 on the grounds that Briggs had not followed proper notification procedure. She paid the debt in full on the 1st of October, 1878, and walked out of Mr. Harrington's office into a day so blue and clean and wide that she stopped on the boardwalk and simply breathed for a long moment. Milton was waiting by the horses. She had not asked him to come, he had come anyway. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, a real, full smile, not the small contained expressions he usually allowed himself, and the impact of it on her was so sudden and physical that she actually put her hand out and touched the post beside her, just to have something to hold on to. This was the moment she admitted to herself that she was in terrible trouble of a completely different kind than Clarence Briggs. The admission, once made, could not be unmade. She drove home from Caldwell that day in a state of internal turmoil that she managed with rigid self-control for about 48 hours, during which she was brisk and efficient and politely distant when Milton arrived in the mornings. And then on the 3rd morning after the debt was paid, she woke up at 4 in the morning from a dream she could not quite remember, but that had left her heart hammering and her face warm. And she lay in the dark listening to Henry breathing in the next room and understood, with the calm clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of the night, that she was in love with Milton Townsend. She was furious about it. She lay there for 2 hours cataloging the reasons this was impractical, premature, ill-considered, and generally inadvisable. She had been a widow for 15 months. She had a child. She had a farm that was barely on its feet. She had a complicated history with marriage, in that her one experience of it had ended with a man who hid things from her, and then died and left her with the consequences of his hiding. She had no evidence that Milton had any feelings for her beyond the kind of steady, neighborly regard that he probably extended to everyone in Harrow County who needed it. This last point she pursued at length and then rejected almost immediately, because she was an intelligent woman and the evidence was considerable and specific, and she knew, on some level she was not ready to speak aloud, that what Milton Townsend did every morning at her property was not neighborly regard. It was something else. It was a language she had been reading correctly for months and pretending not to understand. She got up, made the coffee, and went to the door when she heard his horse at the creek. He came into the barnyard and began his work as he always did in that quiet, efficient way of his. She watched from the door for a while and then she went out. "Milton," she said. He turned. Something in her voice or her face made him go very still. "I need to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything because I am likely to lose my nerve in the middle of it and I would rather not do that." "All right," he said. She took a breath. You have been coming here every morning for 11 months. You have done work that I did not ask you to do, and that I know you did not do because you thought I was incapable of doing it myself. I have not always been gracious about it, and I have sometimes been actively difficult, and you have continued anyway." She stopped. "I want to know why. I want you to tell me honestly, without being careful about my feelings, why you come here." Milton set down the bucket he was holding. He looked at her for a long time, and the morning was so quiet around them that she could hear the creak and the wind in the grass and her own heartbeat. "Because I could not," he said finally. "The first morning I came, when the norther hit and I knew you were over here alone with the baby and those animals, I told myself it was just the right thing to do. The neighborly thing." He paused. "That lasted about 2 mornings. After that I stopped pretending it was about the chores." She stared at him. "I've been trying to find the right time to tell you for about 6 months," he said, "and I kept losing my nerve, which is—" He made a small helpless gesture that was so unlike his usual self-containment that it moved her more than anything else could have. "I didn't want to say it wrong. I didn't want to frighten you off. He stopped again. His jaw worked. "You're the most remarkable person I have ever known, Gertrude. And I'm aware that saying it now, after everything you've just been through, is the worst possible timing." She crossed the yard toward him. She was not sure she made a conscious decision to do it. She was simply suddenly standing 2 feet in front of him, looking up at him, and his eyes were doing that thing she recognized, that thing she had been refusing to name for months. "Ask me," she said. He understood immediately. "Would you allow me to call on you?" he said. "In the proper way, as a man calling on a woman." He stopped. "As a man who would very much like the chance to court you, Gertrude, if you're willing." She reached out and took his hand, and the contact was simple and electric and felt like stepping out of a dark room into light. "I'm willing," she said. They stood like that in the barn yard for a moment, and then the rooster announced his opinion loudly from inside the barn, and the spell broke, and Milton laughed, that real, full-face laugh, and Gertrude laughed too, and Henry appeared at the door of the soddy in his small nightshirt demanding to know what was funny, and the morning began the way mornings do, with the ordinary world flowing back in around the extraordinary. But something had changed. Everything had changed, and they both knew it. The courting that followed was one of the most unexpectedly joyful periods of Gertrude's life, which surprised her, because she had not expected to be surprised by joy again. It was structured and proper, in the way that the times required, Milton calling formally in the evenings when work permitted, accompanied sometimes by Esteban as a silent and completely unnecessary chaperone, sitting on Gertrude's small step and talking while Henry fell asleep in her lap. But within that proper structure, there was something between them that Gertrude had not had with Thomas, that particular ease of 2 people who have already seen each other at their most difficult and most honest before they ever started trying to impress each other. He brought her things, not flowers or chocolates, because he understood her too well for those. He brought her a new hinge for the barn door, and a length of good rope, and a book he'd sent away to Wichita for, because she had mentioned once that she wished she had something new to read in the evenings. And the book was a collection of essays by a woman philosopher that he had chosen because, he said, he thought she'd argue with at least half of it and find the rest interesting. She did, and she told him which parts she'd argued with and which she'd agreed with. And the conversation that followed over several evenings was one of the best she could remember having. He told her about his dark past, which was not so much dark as it was a series of choices made by a young man who had been handed too much responsibility too early, and had handled it by eliminating everything from his life except work. The loneliness of the ranch, the years of eating alone and working from before light until after dark, and waking up in the night to the immense quiet of the prairie, and the feeling that he was the last person on earth. Louisa had not been able to fix that loneliness, he said, because he had not known then how to let anyone fix it. He had been too closed, too self-sufficient in the defensive sense, too afraid of needing anything. And then Gertrude had asked. And then a woman moved in on the other side of Cutter's Creek, he said, and I watched her fix her own barn door in a blizzard, and I thought, there is a person who understands something I need to understand. And what is that? That hard things are worth doing, he said simply. That a life worth living requires you to choose it every day, not just once. She had looked at him in the lamplight through the open door of the soddy, this careful, patient, deeply honest man, and the love she felt for him was so large and so certain that it frightened her a little, the way good large things always do when you first understand their full dimension. Henry had woken up then and demanded water, and the evening had ended in the ordinary way, but Milton had stood at her door before mounting his horse and said quietly, "I love you, Gertrude. I wanted you to know that. I'm not asking for anything back from it. I just didn't want to keep holding it in." She had wanted to say it back. She had been almost there. But some residue of caution, some piece of the woman who had learned not to trust in the reliability of things she loved, had kept the words behind her teeth. He had gone home. She had gone inside. She had sat by the stove with Henry sleeping beside her and thought about what it meant to love someone and not say so, and whether that was wisdom or just fear dressed up as wisdom. She decided it was fear. She did not make the decision alone. She wrote her mother a letter, her mother being one of the sharpest women she knew, currently living in Columbus, Ohio, running a household with the efficiency of a military general, and described the situation, and her mother wrote back with characteristic economy. "Gertrude Ann Ellsworth, if you are asking me whether you should tell this man that you love him, the answer is that you should have done so a month ago, and the only question now is what is stopping you. And from what you tell me, it is stubbornness, which I recognize as a family trait but which is not serving you here." Gertrude read this letter 3 times. Then she put on her coat, walked out to the barn, saddled Trouble, who was miraculously cooperative about it, and rode across Cutter's Creek to the Townsend ranch. It was a Sunday afternoon in late November, cold and clear, with the sky a particular deep blue that only happened in late autumn on the Kansas prairie. She had never been to the ranch before. It was a substantial operation, a large main house built of timber and stone, a collection of barns and outbuildings, corrals that held good Hereford cattle standing in the cold looking dignified. She found Milton at the fence of the main corral, doing something careful and technical with a gate latch that was giving him trouble, and when he looked up and saw her riding across the yard, his expression went through several things very quickly before settling on something careful and hopeful. She dismounted and walked to the fence. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it 3 weeks ago, and I am saying it now, and I would appreciate it if we could move forward from here." Milton stood very still for a moment. Then he set down his tools, came around the gate and walked toward her, and she stood her ground and watched him come, and when he was close enough he took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was almost painful and said, "Gertrude." Just her name, just that. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. Right there in the cold November afternoon in the yard of his ranch, with the Hereford cattle observing and Esteban almost certainly watching from somewhere, and Trouble expressing strong opinions from the hitching post about the wind, Milton Townsend kissed Gertrude Ellsworth, and she kissed him back with the wholeness of a woman who had decided to stop being afraid of the good things. He proposed on the first day of December formally, in the presence of Henry, who did not fully understand the proceedings, but contributed enthusiastically by presenting Milton with a particularly fine stick he had been saving, which Milton accepted with complete seriousness and tucked into his coat pocket. He proposed with a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small turquoise set in silver, not fancy but honest, which was exactly right for a man proposing to this particular woman. He did it on one knee in her kitchen because it was too cold to do it outside, and because her kitchen, small and warm and smelling of the dried herbs she hung from the ceiling, was in fact a very good place to make a promise. "Will you marry me, Gertrude?" he said. "Not because you need someone to manage things, because you don't. Not because Henry needs a father, though I would be honored to be one, but because I would like to spend the rest of my life being the person who arrives early in the mornings and is glad to be here." She took his face in her hands, the way he had taken hers. "Yes," she said, as she had said before, and this yes was even better than the first one because it had more behind it. Henry, understanding that something excellent was happening, climbed onto both of them simultaneously and had to be disentangled, and this served as the first official act of the Townsend family, which seemed exactly appropriate. They were married in February of 1879, on a day when the sky was threatening snow, and then changed its mind and offered up a pale winter sunshine instead, as though the weather itself had been persuaded by the occasion. The wedding was held in the Caldwell Church, which was small and draughty and smelled pleasantly of old wood and candle wax. Mr. Harrington stood up for Milton, being the man who knew him best in town. Mrs. Abernethy stood up for Gertrude, who had no family close enough to come on short notice, and who had become something like a friend through the shared business of chickens and survival. Gertrude wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, cut simply and well, because she was not a woman who needed ornamentation to be worth looking at. She wore her hair in a knot at the back of her neck, with a few small flowers from Mrs. Holcomb's greenhouse tucked into it, and she carried a small bouquet of dried lavender because there was nothing fresh in February in Kansas, and she was not interested in pretending otherwise. She walked down the aisle with Henry on her hip, because there was no one to hold him, and she was not about to leave him out of the most important moment of her life. Milton stood at the altar in a good dark suit that he had clearly purchased new for the occasion, and when she walked through the door and he saw her, he went very still in a way that she was beginning to recognize as him feeling something almost too large to contain. She met his eyes and smiled, and his stillness broke into that full, real smile, and the minister coughed politely and said, "Shall we begin?" The vows were the traditional ones, but they both said them with a feeling that transcended the tradition, meaning every word with the particular intensity of people who have chosen this choice with full awareness of its weight. When the minister said he could kiss the bride, Milton kissed her with a gentle certainty that made the small congregation, perhaps 30 people, neighbors and townspeople who had come out on a cold February day to witness this, make the specific sound of collective approval. Henry took advantage of the general distraction to eat an entire candle stub from the front pew. They had a small gathering afterward at the ranch, where Esteban had been cooking for 2 days, and the result was a table of food that represented his considerable culinary skills and his quiet, warm approval of the whole arrangement. Rafe and Curly had decorated the main room of the house with cedar boughs, and had clearly argued about the placement of nearly everything, the evidence being the somewhat asymmetrical arrangement of the greenery. James Townsend had made it down from Denver despite the weather, and proved to be a version of Milton who talked considerably more and laughed more easily, which was entertaining, and which Milton bore with the patience of an older brother accustomed to his younger sibling's particular brand of charm. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone home and Henry had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire clutching the stick he had given Milton at the proposal, now returned to him as a kind of household token, Gertrude and Milton stood together in the doorway of what was now their house and looked at the winter prairie under a sky thick with stars. "I'm going to make the soddy into a proper storage cellar," she said. "The ground there is good for it." He laughed quietly. "That's what you're thinking about right now." "I'm thinking about several things at once," she said. "I have always been able to hold multiple thoughts at once. It's one of my better qualities." "It is," he agreed. She leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her, and they stood like that while the stars moved slowly overhead and the creek murmured somewhere in the dark below the hill, and Gertrude Ellsworth Townsend understood, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had survived hard things and arrived on the other side intact, that this was what the hard things had been for, not as punishment, not as test, but as the road that led here, to this door, to this man, to this life that was hers in a way that nothing before it had been. The first year of their marriage was a partnership in the fullest sense, two people who had each run their own enterprises, and who now had to learn the particular art of running one together without losing the independence that had made each of them who they were. It was not always smooth. Gertrude had opinions about how the south pasture should be managed that differed from Milton's, and she made them known with complete directness. And he listened and occasionally changed his plans and occasionally didn't and explained why, and she listened in return. And this system of mutual regard and honest argument served them very well. She took over the management of the household finances for the combined operation and found that Milton, who was excellent with cattle and land and deeply practical decisions, had a mild but persistent tendency to undervalue his own time when calculating costs, which she corrected systematically. He took over the negotiations with the Caldwell merchants for the household supplies because Gertrude was too honest for horse trading, which she acknowledged was true, and which she considered a virtue even if it was sometimes a commercial disadvantage. They moved Gertrude's remaining operation, Patience the cow, Trouble the horse, the remaining chickens, across the creek to the ranch, and she converted her original soddy into the root cellar she had discussed. The Holcomb girl came to help with Henry 3 mornings a week, which freed Gertrude to work alongside Milton in the management of the ranch in ways that proved valuable to both. Henry thrived. He was 3 years old and full of opinions and energy, and he had Milton's capacity for careful observation and Gertrude's capacity for complete and vocal certainty about whatever he had observed, which was a combination that kept everyone on their toes. He called Milton Papa, which he had decided on himself one morning, and which had made Milton set down his coffee cup and look at the ceiling for a moment in a way that told Gertrude everything about what the word meant to him. In the early autumn of 1879, Gertrude understood that she was pregnant. She told Milton on a morning when the light was gold and slanted through the kitchen window, and Henry was outside in the yard conducting some kind of negotiation with a grasshopper. She said it simply, standing at the stove, and Milton, who had been sitting at the table with the ranch account books, went still in that way of his. "When?" he asked. "March, I think, perhaps February." He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took her hands and held them and said, "Are you well?" It was the first thing he asked. Not "Are you sure?" Not "Are you happy?" Not any of the 1,000 other questions. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them, and she felt the warmth of it move all the way through her. The boy arrived in the middle of a late February snowstorm in 1880, which was somewhat dramatic but not dangerous, as Mrs. Abernethy proved to be an excellent midwife in addition to her other talents, and Milton paced the kitchen with the focus of a man who desperately needed something to do and had been firmly told by Mrs. Abernethy that there was nothing for him to do and that he should please sit down. He did not sit down. The baby was large and healthy and arrived with strong opinions about the cold air, which he expressed at volume. Milton came in when he was summoned and stood beside the bed looking at Gertrude, and then at the bundle in her arms with an expression she had no words for, something so open and unguarded that she loved him even more for it, which she would not have thought possible. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put their son in his arms, and Milton held the baby with the careful, attentive focus he brought to every important thing, and the baby grabbed his finger with the determined grip of the newly arrived. "What do we call him?" Milton asked. "I thought Thomas," Gertrude said. "For his father." She paused. "My first husband was not a perfect man, but he brought me here. He gave me Henry. And I wouldn't have arrived at this without him, even if the way he arranged it was considerably more complicated than it needed to be." Milton looked at her with that particular quality of seeing she had come to rely on. "Thomas Milton Townsend," he said. She smiled. That's a lot of name for a very small person. He'll grow into it, Milton said. Henry, who had been held at the edge of the room with what he considered deeply unjust constraint during the whole business, was allowed in to meet his brother, and the meeting was everything a meeting between a 4-year-old and a new baby could be: loud, enthusiastic, interrupted twice by Mrs. Abernethy's intervention, and ending with Henry declaring that the baby's head was very soft and that he would be in charge of explaining things to him. "That's a big job," Milton told him seriously. "I know," Henry said, with the gravity of a boy who had been waiting for big jobs. The ranch grew through the early years of the 1880s. Milton expanded his Hereford herd and developed a relationship with the new rail connection coming through Caldwell that allowed him to ship cattle east more efficiently than the old trail drives had permitted. Gertrude managed the books and the household and raised her children, and continued to have strong opinions about every aspect of the operation, which Milton continued to value even when they disagreed. Esteban, who had been with the Townsends through everything, became something like family in the fullest sense, eating at their table and being consulted on decisions that affected the ranch. And Gertrude made sure this was so because she understood that the invisible contributions of loyal people were among the most valuable things in any enterprise and deserved to be acknowledged accordingly. She had not forgotten the injustice of Clarence Briggs, nor the broader pattern Milton had described: the land speculators targeting women and families in difficulty, picking at the legal edges of homestead claims. She began attending the county land meetings that were held quarterly in Caldwell, at first as an observer and then as a participant, and she became known in those meetings as a woman who had read the relevant statutes and was not afraid to cite them. She helped 2 other women in the county navigate similar debt claims and was instrumental in getting a local petition together that was sent to the state legislature asking for stronger protections for homestead widows. The petition did not accomplish everything she hoped, but it accomplished some things, and some things were better than nothing, and Gertrude Ellsworth Townsend was not a woman who waited for everything before she accepted some. Thomas grew from a large determined baby into a large determined boy who had Milton's coloring and Gertrude's absolute refusal to be deterred by anything, which was a formidable combination. He was followed, in the spring of 1882, by a daughter. They had not known it would be a girl. The uncertainty had not mattered to either of them. Gertrude, in particular, was notably indifferent to the question, having produced a boy first and a boy second, and having no strong feelings about needing the set to proceed in any particular direction. But the girl arrived, small and quiet and wide-eyed, looking at the world with an expression of deep assessment that was immediately and completely her own. And Gertrude held her and felt the specific love of a mother for a daughter and understood, with a quiet ache, that she would try to give this person every tool she had not been given, every piece of knowledge she had had to learn the hard way. "Ruth," she said when Milton asked about the name, "for my mother." "Ruth Eleanor Townsend," Milton said, tasting the name. "She looks like you." "She looks like herself," Gertrude said firmly, which was the point. The children grew. The ranch grew. Caldwell itself grew and changed in the way of frontier towns in the 1880s, with the wildest edge of the cattle trade years gradually giving way to a more settled commerce, the saloons not disappearing but the shooting decreasing, a proper school established that all 3 Townsend children eventually attended, a second church built, a women's improvement society that Gertrude joined and quickly became the most formidable member of. James came from Denver more often now, as his law practice had established itself, and he had a little more freedom with his time. He had married a woman named Clara who had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a directness that immediately made her and Gertrude devoted friends. The 2 families spent holidays together, and the holidays were loud and food-heavy and argued through, and completely wonderful. Milton and Gertrude did not become easy with each other in the way that sometimes happens to married people, where the love becomes comfortable and the comfort becomes invisible. They remained, throughout all the years, particular to each other, still attentive, still genuinely interested, still capable of surprising the other with a thought or a feeling that the other had not known was there. This was partly temperament and partly choice, the daily choice to look at the person you had chosen and see them freshly. The mornings remained theirs in a specific way. Milton no longer needed to arrive early to someone else's barn, but he still rose before dawn. It was simply his nature, and Gertrude, who had been rising early since her first winter alone, rose with him, and they had the first hour of each day together in the kitchen while the rest of the house slept, with the coffee and the quiet and whatever the day had put on their minds. These mornings were the thread that ran through everything, the constant against which everything else was measured. It was in one of these mornings, in the autumn of 1884, that Milton set down his coffee and looked at her across the kitchen table, with an expression she recognized as him working up to something. "Ames has asked if I'd consider buying his partner's share of the Denver law office," he said, "and coming to Denver." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you want?" "No," he said simply. "I want to be here. This is home. I just wanted you to know," he asked, because I didn't want to have a hidden conversation. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Thank you," she said, "for not hiding things." He turned his hand over and held hers. "We don't do that," he said. That was always the agreement. She thought about Thomas, about the debt he had hidden, about all the ways that love could go wrong when people kept secrets. She thought about how different this was, how chosen this was. "No," she said, "we don't." They sat with their coffee and watched the light come up over the prairie through the kitchen window, the same light that had come up every morning for the 7 years of their marriage, gold and slow and enormous, the way light on the plains always is, as though it has all the space in the world to arrive. Henry was 14 now, tall and serious and already useful in ways that suggested he would eventually be running the ranch, which both his parents recognized and discussed openly with him, because they were the kind of parents who thought you should talk to your children about the future as though they were intelligent enough to participate in it. Thomas was 4 and conducted himself with the seriousness of someone who had important business to attend to, which he generally did, the business in question usually involving sticks, mud, or some kind of engineering project that invariably required more water than the project could actually contain. Ruth, at 2, was observing all of it with those wide, considering eyes and storing information for later use. The ranch had 1,000 head of cattle now, good Hereford stock, and its reputation for quality beef was established enough that buyers came to them rather than the other way around. Gertrude had a long-standing arrangement with a merchant in Caldwell to supply eggs and preserved goods and the dried apple pie, which had become locally famous, and for which she had, with characteristic practicality, negotiated a very fair price. The operation supported the family well, supported Esteban and Rafe and Curly, and the 2 additional hands they'd taken on in 1883, and produced a modest but reliable surplus that Gertrude put away with the discipline of a woman who had learned what it felt like to be $30 short of losing everything. She had never told Milton how close she had come, in those first months of the debt crisis, to genuine despair. She had not hidden it from him deliberately. It was simply that the moment had passed and the habit of self-sufficiency was deep, and the words for that particular darkness had seemed unnecessary once she was out of it. But one evening, lying beside him in the dark after the house had gone quiet, she told him all of it. The night she had sat with the letter and added the arithmetic for the 4th time, hoping the numbers would change. The morning she had looked at the soddy and thought that perhaps she had made a mistake, perhaps Ohio was where she should have gone, perhaps the decision to come to Kansas had been the recklessness of a woman who didn't know her own limits. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "I didn't know it was that bad," he said. "I know you didn't. I'm sorry I didn't tell you then." "Don't be." He shifted, turned toward her in the dark. I want to know those things, Gertrude. Even when they're past, especially when they're past. Why? Because it's all part of who you are, and I want all of it, the hard parts too. She lay there in the dark feeling the completeness of that, the way a love that wants the hard parts is different from a love that only wants the good ones. It was the difference between someone who sees you and someone who sees the version of you that's easier to love. I love you, she said, to the ceiling, to the dark, to the man beside her. I know, he said. I love you too. Now go to sleep. She laughed and turned her face into his shoulder and did exactly that. The years arranged themselves in the good way that years do when you're too busy living inside them to count them. Henry grew into a young man of 20 by 1886, steady and sensible, who had his mother's work ethic and his father's way with cattle, and was beginning to fill in the role of the ranch's future with a naturalness that made both Milton and Gertrude proud in the quiet way of parents who are trying not to be presumptuous about their children's choices. Thomas at 6 was his brother's shadow and his father's favorite student in matters involving horses, and Ruth at 4 had reached the stage of having so many questions about everything that some evening's supper conversation was entirely conducted at her pace, which meant it covered an enormous range of topics in rapid succession. Gertrude turned 38 in 1886, and Milton threw her a birthday supper that was entirely his own planning, which meant it was also Esteban's planning because Milton's culinary range was limited, but the intention was entirely his own and she valued that. He gave her a present that startled her, a writing desk. Small, beautiful, made of walnut, with a hinged top and small compartments inside for paper and ink and the other tools of a writer. You write letters for half the county, he said, and you've been keeping that journal for 6 years on a corner of the kitchen table. You should have a proper place to do it. She ran her hand over the smooth surface of the desk and felt something she hadn't expected, a sudden, clear recognition that he had been paying attention to her in all the ordinary ways, every day, and that this was what love looked like over years. Not the dramatic gestures, but the accumulated evidence of watching, of seeing, of knowing. Milton, she said. Don't cry, he said, which was probably the wrong thing to say because it made her cry slightly, which she recovered from very quickly because she was Gertrude Ellsworth Townsend, and excessive weeping was not in her inventory. I love you enormously, she said, once she had finished not quite crying. I know, he said warmly, and she picked up the letter opener from the new desk and pointed it at him in a way that made him hold up his hands. In the spring of 1887, James and Clara moved to Caldwell. James had decided that a county seat growing as fast as Caldwell was a better market for his legal services than Denver, and Clara had decided the same thing on the basis that she missed Gertrude and found Denver's altitude exhausting. They bought a house in town, and James opened an office, and the two families were now close enough for frequent Sunday dinners, which became a fixture of the weeks in the best possible way. Clara, who had been trying to have a child for some years without success, found herself pregnant in the autumn of 1887, and Gertrude watched her friend navigate the hope and anxiety of that with a particular tender care, wanting everything to go well with the fierce loyalty she extended to people she loved. The pregnancy went well. A boy arrived in May of 1888, healthy and loud, and was named Ellsworth James Townsend, the first name being both a family surname and a tribute that made Gertrude sit down in Clara's bedroom after the birth and hold the baby for a while without saying anything while her eyes did something she would categorize later as a reaction to the warm room and not to emotion. The summer of 1888 was one of the best of Gertrude's life, looking back. The ranch was doing well. The children were healthy. The community around them was stable and known, full of people she had worked beside and argued with and helped and been helped by over the 11 years since she had arrived on the morning stage from Wichita with $40 and a land deed and a 7-month-old child, and nothing to prove to anyone but everything to prove to herself. She was walking the creek one August evening with Milton, the children in the house with Esteban's excellent supervision, the air still warm and the sky beginning to go the particular orange-pink of a Kansas sunset, which was one of the genuinely spectacular things the plains offered without apology, when she realized she had not thought about leaving for years, had not thought about Ohio, or the decision to stay, or the fear of the first winter. All of that had receded so completely into the past that she had to actively remember it was there. "What are you thinking?" Milton asked, the way he did when he saw her face go a certain distance away. "That I'm glad I stayed," she said. "That first winter I almost didn't." He looked at her. "Almost. Not really almost," she admitted. "I never would have gone, but I thought about it once, for about an hour." She looked at the creek, at the water moving over the flat stones, at the cottonwoods on the bank turning their leaves in the evening wind. "I'm glad I didn't. I'm enormously glad I didn't." He took her hand, the way he had taken it that first morning when she had said she was willing, only now there was nothing tentative in the gesture, only the easy certainty of long practice. "So am I," he said. They walked back to the house in the fading light, and from a distance the ranch looked like exactly what it was, a place where people lived who had chosen to live there, where the lights in the windows meant supper and children and conversation, and the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable goodness of a life built carefully on honest ground. Henry met them at the door, looking serious. "Thomas has put a frog in Ruth's bed," he said. "Ruth is not upset about this because she wants to keep it, but I thought you should know." "Good thinking," his father said, and went inside to have a conversation about frogs and bedrooms, and Gertrude stood in the doorway for a moment listening to the house and feeling the gratitude of it, the full weight of everything she had been given, and everything she had fought for, and everything she had chosen, settle through her like warm light. She went inside. There were more years to come, good ones, full of the substance and texture of a life being lived with full attention. Ruth, who at 8 had decided she wanted to be a doctor, and at 10 had not changed her mind, and at 12 had still not changed her mind, became the most vocal and determined person in the household on the subject of her future education. And Gertrude supported this with everything she had because she understood from the inside what it meant for a woman to be told what she could and could not do with her own mind. They wrote to several schools and found one in Topeka that accepted women students in their medical preparation program. And when Ruth was 17 and the time came, Gertrude took her there herself on the train and helped her get settled, and then rode back to Caldwell on the evening train feeling proud and bereft in equal measure, which was the exact tax that loving someone independent costs you. Thomas, who had grown into a young man of his father's temperament with a particular gift for the mechanical, left at 18 to apprentice with a machinist in Wichita, a decision that surprised no one who had watched him engineer various creek diversion schemes with increasing sophistication since age 7. He came home for holidays and summers for a while, and then came home for good at 21, bringing with him a young woman named Sarah who was from a Wichita Mennonite family, and who was quiet and competent, and had hands that were never still, and who understood completely and immediately the way the Townsend household worked, which was to say by everyone doing their share and saying what they thought. Sarah and Gertrude liked each other from the first day, which was a relief to Thomas, who had privately worried about it. Henry married at 23, a local girl named Frances Holcomb, the eldest daughter of the Holcomb family who had been neighbors since Gertrude's first year, the same girl who had once sat with Henry so his mother could work. There was something right and circular about it, a closing of a loop that Gertrude found deeply satisfying. Frances was capable and kind and slightly exasperated by Henry's tendency to understate every situation, and this exasperation would, Gertrude predicted, keep the marriage lively for decades. The Townsend house in those years in the early 1890s was the kind of house that people drifted toward. James and Clara came for Sunday supper. Esteban, who was getting old but not slower, held court at the kitchen table and told stories that the grandchildren would eventually demand to hear again. The children of Henry and Frances, the first grandchildren arriving in 1889 with a boy named William, were treated by Milton with the same careful, attentive gravity he had always given to small people, and they adored him for it. And Gertrude watched her husband on the floor with a 2-year-old grandchild, explaining something about horses with complete seriousness, and felt a love for him so deep and familiar it was indistinguishable from the ground beneath her feet. She was 45 in 1893. Milton was 46. They were in the absolute prime of the life they had built, the structure complete and solid, the future visible in the faces of their children and grandchildren. Neither of them was done. The ranch still required their full attention, and they gave it. Gertrude still kept the books and attended the county meetings, though she had passed the most vigorous of her legal advocacy work to James, who incorporated it into his practice. She still wrote letters for people who needed them, and still made the dried apple pie, and still rose before dawn to sit in the kitchen with her coffee and her husband in the first quiet hour of the day, which had been there since the beginning and showed no signs of being relinquished. One particular morning in October of 1893, when the autumn was at its peak, and the cottonwoods along Cutter's Creek were burning yellow against the blue sky, Gertrude sat across from Milton at the kitchen table and watched him read the week's paper, which James had saved for them from his office, and she thought about all the mornings that had made this one. The mornings she had watched from the window of the soddy as a dark shape moved through the pre-dawn yard. The mornings they had stood on her small step with their coffee and talked about weather and cattle and books. The morning she had told him to stop coming, and the morning she had told him she loved him, and all the mornings in between and after, the whole great accumulated wealth of mornings that had brought them here, to this table, to this kitchen, to this life. "Milton," she said. He looked up from the paper. "I want you to know," she said, "that you were the best decision I ever made." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that was still, after 16 years, capable of doing something to her chest. "You didn't decide me," he said. "I decided you. You just eventually agreed." She laughed, and the laugh filled the kitchen, and the morning light came through the window and lay across the table between them, and somewhere in the house a grandchild began to wake up, and the day began the way good days do, with everything that mattered already exactly where it needed to be. The autumn of 1893 gave way to winter, and winter to spring, and the seasons moved in their reliable way around the life that Gertrude and Milton had built together with their hands and their stubbornness and their considerable love. The ranch passed increasingly into Henry's management, not by any formal decision, but by the natural transfer of energy from one generation to the next. Milton still present and consulted and engaged, but with a slightly longer morning with the coffee, and a slightly more leisurely approach to the day that he had been earning for 20 years. Gertrude's writing desk, the walnut one with the hinged lid, became the center of a project she had been avoiding for years. The systematic recording of everything she had learned about running a property alone, about the legal protections available to women homesteaders, about the practical knowledge of soil and water and livestock, and whether that she had accumulated over nearly 2 decades on the Kansas prairie. She wrote it in plain, clear language, the way she did everything, and when she was done, she had 43 pages of the most useful document that had ever been produced in Harrow County, and she sent copies to the Women's Improvement Society in Caldwell, to the Wichita branch of a women's organization she corresponded with, and to her daughter Ruth, who was by then completing her medical studies with the dedication of a person for whom the only acceptable standard was excellence. Ruth came home in the summer of 1895, newly qualified and utterly determined, and set up a medical practice in Caldwell that served every member of the community regardless of their ability to pay. A policy that caused some consternation among the established physicians in Wichita and considerable gratitude among the families in Harrow County, who had always made do with veterinary medicine and prayer in roughly equal measure. She was 23, and she was her mother's daughter, and she came to Sunday supper every week and argued about everything and ate 3 helpings of everything, and made the whole table louder and better. Thomas and Sarah had their first child in 1895, a girl they named Gertrude, which caused the original Gertrude to sit very still for a moment before saying that it was a very large name, and she hoped the girl was prepared for it. Thomas said that she came from good stock and would manage. Gertrude did not argue with this. The summer of 1896 arrived with the particular quality of a summer that has been prepared for over a long time, warm and golden and generous, with enough rain to keep the grass green, and enough sun to ripen everything that needed ripening. Milton turned 49 that June, a fact he observed with the philosophical equanimity he brought to most things, and Gertrude made him a birthday supper with all his favorite things and the dried apple pie, which she still made the best of in the county, and sat across the table from him in the lamplight, and thought that he was, if anything, more handsome at 49 than he had been when she first stood next to him in Horner's Mercantile, and refused to thank him for the salt. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he always asked when her face went somewhere. "I'm thinking that you look good," she said simply, because at 48 there was no longer any particular reason to be circumspect about these things. His smile was the full one, the real one. "You look extraordinary," he said, with the directness he had always had when he meant something completely. After supper, after Henry and Frances and the children had gone home and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch, a proper porch now, added to the house years ago, with good chairs and a view of the plains going dark under a sky filling up with stars, and Milton took her hand the way he always did, and they sat for a while in the particular companionable silence that is one of the great gifts of a long marriage. "Do you remember the salt?" Gertrude asked. "The salt? In Horner's Mercantile. The first time we met, you bought me a sack of salt without asking. I remember," he said, "you didn't thank me. You didn't require thanks." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I also remember thinking that you were the most formidable woman I had ever seen, and that you would be perfectly fine without the salt or anything else from me. But you kept coming anyway." "I kept coming anyway," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the stars, the great Kansas sky full of them, enormous and impersonal and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have nothing to prove. "I'm glad you did," she said, "in case that was ever in question." "It was never in question," he said, which was not quite true and which they both knew and which she loved him for saying anyway. The children were grown and building their own lives. The grandchildren were growing. Ruth was healing people. Thomas was building things. Henry was running the ranch with Frances by his side and small William and his 2 younger siblings making the farmhouse loud with life. The town of Caldwell continued its evolution into the kind of settled, working community that the plains demanded, still rough in places, still hard in the ways that hard country is always hard, but with a permanence now that the earliest years had not had. Gertrude and Milton were part of that permanence. They were the people the county knew, who had been there through the uncertain years, and were still there, still working, still present at the meetings and the church and the suppers and the funerals and the weddings and the births, the connective tissue of a community that needed people who stayed. On a morning in the September of 1897, 20 years after Gertrude had arrived in Caldwell on the morning stage with her $40 and her determination, she woke before dawn and lay for a moment in the dark listening to her husband breathe beside her, and to the house around her, and to the prairie beyond the house, that great patient expanse that had been asking things of her for 20 years, and that she had answered every time, with everything she had. She got up quietly and went to the kitchen and made the coffee and stood at the window while it brewed, watching the dark begin to change, the first gray-blue of approaching light coming up from the east over the flat land. She heard him get up, she heard his boots on the floor, she heard him come to stand behind her and then his hands on her shoulders and then his voice, quiet in the early kitchen. "What are you looking at?" "The morning," she said. "It's starting." "It always does," he said. She turned and faced him in the early light. This man who had come to her in the dark for so many years before she had let herself understand why, who had done the work she had not asked him to do, and would not have asked him to do because asking was the hardest thing, who had arrived early every morning not because she needed him to, but because he needed to be there, because the chores were the language he had found for something that had no other words yet. She put her hand against his face and he covered it with his, and the morning light came into the kitchen slowly, the way it always had, gold and patient and immense. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. And the morning began, the way it always began, with the two of them standing in it, ready for whatever it asked of them together. The years continued to be good to them. Ruth brought a young man home at Christmas in 1898, a physician she had met through her medical work, a serious and gentle man named Dr. Edward Marsh, who treated Ruth with a respect and admiration that immediately satisfied both her parents' most important criteria. They were married the following autumn, quietly, in the same Caldwell church where Milton and Gertrude had made their own promises 20 years before, and Gertrude sat in the pew beside her husband and watched her daughter walk down the aisle with the same self-possessed grace she had always carried, and felt the deep satisfaction of a mother who sees her child become exactly who she was supposed to be. The 20th century arrived, as centuries do, without ceremony. Harrow County rang in 1900 with a party at the Caldwell Meeting Hall that involved fiddle music and considerable dancing. And Milton, who had never in Gertrude's knowledge shown any particular interest in dancing, turned out to have been holding a respectable ability in reserve, which surprised her completely and delighted her even more. They danced twice, and the second time she felt 17 years of marriage in the ease of it, the way bodies that have shared a life together move without having to negotiate. By the early years of the new century, the grandchildren were old enough to be interesting companions. William, Henry's eldest, was 11 in 1900 and had his grandmother's love of books and his grandfather's patient way with animals, a combination that Milton predicted would take him either into medicine or ranching, and William himself, when asked, declined to choose. The other grandchildren ranged from 3 to 9 and had between them every possible temperament and gift, and Gertrude loved them all with the specific, attentive love of a grandmother who is interested in people as individuals. The morning ritual never changed. Coffee at dawn, the first hour, the light coming up. The two of them, alone before the house woke, with everything they needed in the room around them and the day waiting to be chosen. This was what love was, Gertrude understood now, in the full wisdom of a life that had been examined from every angle, not the great gestures, though those mattered, not the moments of crisis weathered together, though those shaped you, but the daily choice, the arrival every morning before you were asked, the work done with steady hands and full attention. The coffee shared in the quiet before the world came in, the question asked, "What are you thinking?" and the answer given honestly, and the listening that followed. It was the consistency of choosing. It was the man who came back every morning for 11 months before she let herself understand why, and who came back every morning for the 20 years after that for the same reason, which had never changed and never would. She sat at her walnut desk in the autumn of 1901 and wrote in her journal, which she had kept faithfully since the early years of her marriage. "I have been thinking about what it means to be arrived at, to have someone who comes to where you are and stays. I spent my first year on this land becoming a woman who needed no one and thought this was strength. It is strength in its way. But the greater strength is to need someone well to choose the right person and then choose them again, every day as they choose you. Milton comes in from the barn in a few minutes. The coffee is ready. The light is the color it is every autumn morning, that particular gold that seems to come from inside the prairie rather than from above it. I am not afraid of anything. This is the condition he has made possible, not by removing the things that might frighten me, but by being here beside me for all of them." She closed the journal when she heard his boots on the porch. She poured his coffee. She turned when the door opened and he came in from the early morning, smelling of cold air and hay and the particular outdoor smell that was simply him, and he looked at her across the kitchen the way he always looked, with that full, settled attention, and she handed him his cup. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. Outside, the sun was coming up over the Kansas prairie, the same sun that had come up every morning of their life together, finding them here, in this kitchen, in this life that they had built with such difficulty and such love, the same life they had been choosing every single day since the morning he had first arrived before dawn at a small soddy on the other side of Cutter's Creek, and done the work without being asked, because some things begin long before they are named. And the heart knows what it wants long before the mind is brave enough to say so. This was their morning. It always had been. It always would be. And in the ordinary golden miracle of it, they were home.